This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers, political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Leonard McKinnis, who teaches in the departments of Religion and African American Studies at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Along with a number of scholarly pieces, he is the author of The Black Coptic Church, Race and Imagination in a New Religion from 2023. In this conversation, we discuss the place of religious studies in the Black studies tradition, the relationship between ethnographic and historical research, and how close attention to emerging Black religious sensibilities reveal ethical and political visions to Black study. Good afternoon, Leonard. How are you today?
I'm well, John. Thanks for having me here today.
I'm really excited to have you on the Black Studies podcast. First of all, I just want to publicly acknowledge my not great email over the last month, that you were patient and forgiving. I appreciate that.
It happens to all of us, including me. So,
especially in the month of July, for sure. Yeah. But I do appreciate your patience, and for a lot of reasons, just the graciousness. But most importantly, I just really wanted to get you on the podcast. As part of, obviously, the Black Studies podcast, but also part of what we're trying to make sure we develop across the years of doing this project, which is a really robust representation of religious studies in Black studies. I think in terms of departments and in terms of the way we talk about Black studies, religious studies is really a sort of tertiary part of the field, which is strange given the importance of religion across the Black Atlantic world. And so Ashley and I are both really committed to making sure, among other things, that religious studies is well represented, which is just my long way of saying welcome to the Black Studies podcast. And I'm really excited to have you here, and I appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness.
Yeah, no, John, thank you so much. And I appreciate this intentionality, if you will, of broadening the discourse to include scholars of religion, which, and again, I think, of course, we'll get into this in the conversation today, but it is such an indispensable part of Black life and culture in the diaspora. And I'm not certain, in terms of how I think about Black life, how one examines or studies, evaluates Black culture and Black life without a serious focus on religion. And so I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation, and that religion is sort of an intentional point that this podcast is pushing.
We've had some fantastic episodes, and so I'm sure that this is going to be a really great contribution to that. So thank you so much. Thank you in advance, and we'll have a chance to talk about your research, of course, and talk about how you think about your research and your interests in relation to the field of Black studies, past, present, and future. But of course, we start always the podcast with a more personal question, right? A little more sort of intimate query, which is really just to ask you, what got you interested in Black studies? What got you interested in the study of Black life? But also, what sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I think I would start responding to this question by looking into my own sort of biographical sketch, right? So I'm from Chicago. Right. I grew up in Chicago, and for me, the presence of Black culture and Black life, and more importantly, what interests me, Black religion, was as close to me as, folks in my family. It was just in my face. There's a certain level of intimacy that I grew up with around Black culture, and a culture that I've come to embrace, that I love, and the people who are also present, within this culture, not only as subjects of history or subject of study. I think this is part of the kind of work that I do as well. But it dawned on me very early in life, and early in my sort of academic career, that Black folk were not just subjects of study, but they had something to contribute, right? That they were, in fact, an embodied text that was sort of already producing and thinking about Black life without the vocabulary of academics, right? Without the formal training of academics, but the practice and the cultural norms, the cultural expressions, the way in which Black life was lived around me was already a mural, if you will, of some kind of formation and articulation of Black studies. And I couldn't appreciate that, obviously, until I got older and started to think about the kind of questions that I raise. But I look back over my childhood and I think about the people, the places, the institutions with which I came into contact. And I quickly realized, oh, I've been living around Black studies my whole life. And what my work tries to do is to articulate what I've always seen, right? So it's the childhood curiosity now grounded in some sort of academic discourse. I wasn't supposed to be here, I should say that. When in college, I studied government and history, and it was not in my interest at that time to become an academic. In fact, I was on a track headed toward politics, getting involved in federal politics in particular, while in college. And I look back over these days with a sort of laugh to myself. But in college, I was president of the College Republicans on my campus. And
this is like the Black Studies Podcast confessional. Okay.
It really is. It really is. And then I went off to D.C. and I was an intern in the Bush White House, where I worked alongside President Bush and Condoleezza Rice and others doing some really fantastic work. But it was in that period, while a White House intern, that I started to raise a different set of questions. And I should say that it was the experience of working around and with conservative ideologies and conservative politics that my upbringing and the questions of the people who loved me were very different than the questions that I was wrestling with as someone who was intimately involved in, conservative politics. And I had this kind of moment of reflection, very deep reflection. I was in my third year of college, and I recall John sending a note to a professor back home and sort of confessing that I was in this crisis of sort of working for this conservative administration, but also thinking about the people at home, the people I loved, who I did not see in the imagination of the people for whom I was working, right? But I also had my own faith, my faith that I brought with me, my deep religious roots that came with me to D.C. And so this professor, whose name was Mark Schultz, said to me, "There's a book that you should read, Leonard." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "There's this guy named James H. Cone, and there's a book that Cone writes called God of the Oppressed." Well, I ordered God of the Oppressed. I got my hands on a book, and I read it literally in almost one sitting. And it changed the entire intellectual trajectory of my life, from someone who was, on his way into American politics to someone who was now thinking about the relationship between religion, theology, and Black life. And that was the kind of, jumping board, if you will, that led me to the kinds of questions that I am now raising as a scholar of religion. And so in college, I was all set to go to law school. I had been admitted to law school, and I had this sort of crisis of identity in terms of who I was as a budding young intellectual. And so I quickly shifted gears and went to Harvard Divinity School to study religion. And I knew in that moment, with the people who I worked with, that this was what I was supposed to be doing. And that's what kind of led me to this point of where I am now in terms of looking at religion and studying Black life through the lens of religion, right? And so that is, I enter Black studies through the question of religion and the question of what Black folk have done with religion and how it has helped Black people to wrestle and grapple with what I like to call the situation of displacement, which kind of concretizes my own work.
Thank you for that. That's extremely interesting in so many ways. I feel like as someone married to a Chicago woman, I do have to ask you what high school you went to.
So your wife would know. I went to Lindblom. I
She
went to
went to
Lindblom.
Kenwood. I guess that really matters. So
Yeah. I know Kenwood very well. Kenwood, yeah, Kenwood. Now Kenwood, Lindblom, Whitney Young. All of these are high schools are sort of like, they're the great high schools in Chicago. So
yeah,
I'm not sure a Kenwood person would say that because Kenwood is everything to folks who went to Kenwood.
yes, that's why I asked. I'm just like, okay. But no, but more seriously, that is an amazing story about thinking about the stories, right? How they're reflected in politics, but then in religion, and of course Cohn's work, that relationship between like religion and politics and political and social life, the way those are also blended. I have to say, it's a very Black Studies journey, that also continued with what you said. This phrase, that the lives of Black people that you had grown up with were like these living texts. They were already discourses about what Black life meant, and like that attentiveness and the way that then is you sort of trace like your own journey of trying to detect and not seeing and seeing and what it meant to see and connect and disconnect and all of that. And I love that it was that book that made that shift for you. I just have to say, Aristide's Parish of the Poor had a similar function for me. I was like, and I'm not a religious person, but I was like, where can I find my way into doing this kind of work, right? There's something about the moral gravity of an account of lives that Cohn has, that Aristide has, that so many people have, but I think is really so much at the heart of Black Studies itself.
It really is, John. And I should say something here about how I think about Black people, Black communities that I study with, as someone who is engaged deeply in ethnographic approaches to the study of religion, right? I think about the work of anthropologist Saud Abdul Kabir, right, who writes a wonderful book called Muslim Cool. There's a phrase that Abdul Kabir uses in this text that I have adopted in the way that I think about my own study in Black studies. When Abdul Kabir is in the field doing her research as an anthropologist, so I was already thinking about the sort of nomenclature of referring to people as subjects, and it never sat well with me. But Abdul Kabir gives us this language. She uses the word teachers as opposed to subjects, right? And I quickly learned in the communities that I sit with, that I engaged with, who let me into their worlds to partake and observe their religious practice. That's what happens to me. These folks are my teachers. And so I tell folks all the time, when I am sitting with believers in the Nation of Islam, or sitting with believers in the Black Coptic Church, or any other community that has gained my interest, I am there not as a researcher, but I'm there as a student. In other words, I'm convinced, as I've said earlier, that through religious forms and religious practices that Black folk have already been thinking about the questions of Black studies. They've already been thinking about, what it means to exist and to not be perceived as a human, right? And religion, for many of these people, has become sort of avenues for how they've made sense of this sense of precarity, the precarity of Black life and displacement. And what I find in the study of religion, for many of the groups that I study, that religion provided not just a vocabulary, right, to think about the wrestlings of their existence, but it also provided modes and means with which to think about key things like home and fugitivity, right, and the human and what it means to be human. And so again, to get to your earlier point, I've always been curious about the absence of religion in the Black studies discourse, or the lack thereof, right? It's not completely absent, but the lack thereof, the serious engagement with religion. Because religion for me, by the way, John, is not simply this examination of what people do in the material world, but it also helps me think about how folks are using culture and experience to also think about immaterialism, right? Outside the world, and how those kind of ways of thinking about the world beyond helps to concretize their own existence in this sort of present form. And so for me, religion opens up in the vocabulary of religion, whether we are speaking of Black Christians, Black Muslims, Black Jews, Hebrew Israelites, that there is something about the way in which these individuals have built other worlds, that have also provided other futures and other possibilities that already push back against domination and white supremacy, that pushes back against, scientific ideas that were distorted, right? The lie of white supremacy, if you will. And so anyway, I didn't mean to sort of go off there, but
no, please, no. This is exactly what the podcast is for. Is these kinds of moments of cumulative insight, because I was really struck by that, like you were in what you said. I haven't read the book, but the ethnographic, the people in an ethnography, featured in an ethnography as teachers, and then you also having talked about Black life and Black people as texts, right?
Yeah.
But I would never say, it's not that I would never say, I would absolutely say that I pick up this book, here by, Toni Morrison nonfiction next to me. I would absolutely say she's teaching me things in these essays because it's a text. And so I think that language of text it's not just a kind of post-structuralist trope or something. It's like, no, it really means that like all texts, there's teaching, right? And that moment of teaching is actually where we engage with questions of respect and disrespect, because text can be mistreated, but that idea that something is there to teach you is also that engagement of that moment of humility, respect, dialogue, and the portraits that come out of that. I just got to believe they're much richer.
Oh, absolutely. And I should say that in early forms of Black religion, at least sort of practice among enslaved individuals here in North America, in the United States, they were also very suspicious of text, right? The text was manipulated. I'm speaking about the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Speaking about other forms of socially constructed laws like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. These sort of writings and text were distorted and manipulated in order to give credence, right, to a particular organization of society that required a particular way of being, or not being, I should say, for the maintenance of this sort of white supremacist world, required these, as Calvin Warren would say, people who existed without being, right? This sort of perceived Negro, if you will. But what we encounter in, for instance, the slave narratives or the enslaved narratives, where we inquire in sort of the invisible institution as Black folk are raising and thinking about other ways of religion, is this immediate suspicion with the text. The text, as presented, oftentimes could not be trusted. And so the text became an oral text or an oral tradition, whereby the tellings of history and the tellings of one's encounter with the divine was not always situated inside a book. And so there was a hymn, I ain't got no book religion, right? In other words, a book religion was considered to be the religion of the enslavers. Everything was codified in law. But there are ways that we observe the practices and the formations of Black communities, especially in religion, where the people became the living presence of the oral tradition. And when the elders spoke, when the priests spoke, they were providing a long history, a long legacy of rebellious acts, right? Of ways of thinking about freedom that was intended to never reach them, right? So this, in this sense, I think about the oral tradition and the practice of Black religion is already an act of fugitivity, even before fugitivity became a sort of academic, language or academic way of thinking about the way in which Black folk are sort of are jettisoning, particular forms and formations. I find that fugitivity existed among within the Negro spirituals, right? The fugitivity and fugitive theory was present among Black folk who are looking for freedom. And by the way, using trickery, right? Using trickery and double hermeneutics to relate to each other in ways to confuse the broader structure, right? So, and again, I'm just pushing this narrative here that Black studies has always been a part, for me, of the Black religious tradition. And what I am trying to do in telling the stories and engaging these communities is to shine a light on what has already been, but not a part of this kind of larger discourse that we're engaged in.
So let me then ask you, what is that portrait? To say a little bit about that portrait of Black studies that you work with, because it's really interesting. I mean, you've articulated quite a lot of it, but I'll just ask this anyway, because what you're describing operates in this really interesting space, in relation to, but also very different than, I would say, the two founding principles or impulses of Black studies, which one was the student protests that demanded there be a place, Black studies was that place, for the study of Black life, to cultivate, to appreciate, to understand, to gather together the Black intellectual tradition, whether it's national, diasporic, continental. But also that time in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a moment when Black liberation struggles, radicalism, had really contested, if not outright abolished, some of these boundaries we might casually appeal to, like the difference between study and action, between ideas and prescriptive politics, between community organization and the classroom. And so I think that political imperative of Black studies to have a certain kind of liberatory politics at its center, but also the impulse of Black studies to cultivate and expand and appreciate its intellectual tradition. There's a tension built into the field. And so I'm interested to hear how you think about Black studies, especially sort of emerging out of the context of this founding tension.
Yeah. So for me, the political impulse of Black studies is, in fact, at the core. And by the way, I read the emergence of Black religious traditions as political theology, as political religion, right? In other words, when I think about the very essence of politics, right, I am envisioning this sort of tension between visions of how the world is organized, right? Without saying politics or something is political, Black religion has always been political. It has always been this sort of activist, if you will, tradition that has given birth to various forms of Black religious life. But at the center of Black religious discourse has been, in fact, this pushback against a particular portrait of the political world that did not satisfy the element of the humanity of Black folk, if you will, right? And so if I'm thinking about folks like Denmark Vesey or Nat Turner or some of the early rebellions among the enslaved people who were in fact inspired by a religious impulse, right? I mean, Nat Turner is inspired by his Black Baptist roots, right? He is certainly inspired by a particular political read of the gospel that was in contradistinction to this purely kind of otherworldly read of the gospel that had dominated, if you will, the enslavers' religion, if you will. In the 1960s, we also see this movement, again, with folks like Jim Cone and also Martin King, right, who are deeply involved in the political impulse of the nation. But their political impulse is grounded in a particular hermeneutic, the way in which they are reading sacred text, the way in which they are reading the Gospels. And for me, that political and that social activist impulse, I can trace this in the histories of Black religions and not just Christian faith, right? If you turn, for instance, to the back of the earlier newspaper Muhammad Speaks in the Nation of Islam, the very back page of all of the Muhammad Speaks from the 50s to the 60s every back page included what the Muslims want. It was a political program. It was a political program that included a political economy for Black folk, that included, right, intentionality to diaspora thinking. And by the way, the U.S. is a diasporic spot as well, right? So there's always been, I think, this political leaning in certain Black religious traditions that brings with it, if you will, the impulse of those two tensions that have been present at the core of Black study, but also this idea of global perspective, right, that we find present inside Black studies, thinking about Black life in the aftermath of human enslavement, thinking about Black life in the aftermath of what I call this sort of earthquake experience in the book, when Black life has been shaken to the ground in rubbles. What I find in the history and the tradition of Black religions are groups and people who are thinking about how to build other worlds and using their imagination to do so, right? So for me, the place and the situation of displacement in North America in the aftermath of human enslavement gives rise to all sorts of religious imaginations that are thinking very seriously about the political situation of Black folk, not just the religious situation. And for me, I think it's important, John, to mention that when I consider Black religion or think about Black religion, there is no separation from the religion and the political, right? Yeah. They are completely intertwined because Black religion demands freedom for Black people. Black religion, the way that I think about Black religion at its core, at least, demands freedom, equality, and justice, right? It demands kind of a world that does not denigrate or subjugate Black existence to subaltern status. And so there is, for me, at the core of Black studies, always this political orientation that is always confrontational, if you will, with systems, ideas, and institutions that threaten Black existence. And I entered this discourse taking seriously the ways that Black religion has, in fact, been confrontational to such systems, using religion, theology, and religious practice to do so in ways that were and are very, in fact, political.
Thank you. That's amazing. And that leads to this sort of other question, which is, how do you think this perspective, the perspective that you take in your scholarship and the kind of witness you have to African American religious history or diasporic religious history, how do you think that fits into? I mean, I think you've articulated it quite well, actually, right there. How it fits into the history of Black studies as a field, right? That seeking out that that borderlands between intellectual life and political intervention. But what do you think it pushes in terms of new horizons or new boundaries?
Black religions are always teaching us what we do not know about Black people, number one. What we do not know about the way Black folk wrestle and grapple with Black existence. So thinking about, for instance, my current research on the Nation of Islam, and even my previous book, my first book on the Black Coptic Church, what these traditions are narrating, I think, John, are profound and complex stories about people and these groups' desire to locate home in a space of homelessness. How to locate and build home. The reason why early converts, or I should say reverts, to the Nation of Islam in the 1930s in Detroit, what made the peddler W. Fard Muhammad attractive to these reverts in Detroit and later in Chicago, what made his movement popular was the way in which he described what he was up to, right? So here's this peddler in Detroit going door to door selling items and being invited into the homes of these early believers or these pioneers in the Nation of Islam. And he is using a language like this. Back home, we did not eat like this. Back home, we did not dress like this. Back home, this is how we lived. all of these sort of early pioneers are using the same language to describe their first encounter with W. Fard Muhammad, that he emphasized back home. What that signals to me is that early believers in the Nation of Islam, and it's also true of the Black Coptic Church, it's also true of the Hebrew Israelites, it's also true of, Black Jews. These are individuals who were searching for home. Home is familiar. Home gives people a sense of security, hopefully, right? But there's something about having a place called home when one has been uprooted that is very attractive, right? And so what I find that we gather and gain in studying these religions are different modes and different ways that people have sought to answer the question from a religious standpoint, what does it mean to sing the Lord's song in a strange land? That is, in fact, I think, the core of the groups that I study, at least. They are finding and looking for ways to connect to a longer history, right? So, for instance, many of these groups that I'm curious about are very intentional about saying that, Black history does not begin in enslavement. It is a fundamental, kind of core of their belief system. So what religion does for these individuals is allows them to trace a longer arc of Black history that is not determined by what happens in the New World, right? So for many of these groups, the New World is this interruption in their history, right? So what I find again here is that what religion is helping us to see, because outside of the sort of nationalistic movements, the political movements, who might have been doing similar work in terms of looking back home and looking for homelands and building these longer ancestral traditions, what religion does is gives us insight to how these worlds were linked that included not just the homeland, but it also included a belief system, that included a God, that included connecting people to a higher being. And so I tend to believe that the study of religion opens so many portals into not just contemporary Black life, but how Black life is perceived, how Black life is lived. And we can get more into this, I hope, but that's just kind of the sort of intro to your response to your question.
No, I love that. I mean, that's really profound shit. I mean, seriously, this notion of home, and when you had that, we didn't eat like this, we didn't dress like this, we didn't act like this. That we didn't is such an interesting thing to call somebody to a place in the present rather than mourn the past, but also to call into that moment of the present and future. And I think that so much of what I hear in that is, Black studies has been many things, has many features to it, but you said it at the beginning, part of, if not the central thread of Black studies is to articulate the humanity of Black people. Right. And the way you've talked there with such complexity about the ancestral meaning of that question, not ancestral like in a sort of incantation, but ancestral as something that's impacting this encounter on a doorstep. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And John, moreover, by using this language of back home, that's also a critique of the present order. Right. Yeah. Right. It's so involved in this kind of looking back. That's Sankofa, right? Involved in this looking back is also a way of saying that there's something about the present that is not aligned with your humanity, that does not align with what these traditions would say is the way that you were created to exist, right? So by critiquing things like diet and dress and ways of habitation was a way of suggesting that the present social order is not simply a construction to undermine your contemporary existence, but for many of these groups, it was a critique to say, this is an attempt to disconnect you from who you are, right? So for many of these religions, what religion did was put them back together again, right? And I'm thinking about, the work of Jacob Dorman. In Chosen People, Dorman writes in the beginning that the Hebrew Israelites, right, in their earlier formation would make claims that suggested we are part of this original Jews, right? That this is not home. And they would make these claims about, being connected to the children of Israel, thus on and forth. And I also write in my first book, John, that many of the people who I study, for instance, they lay claim to Ethiopia, right? Of course, they are modern-day Ethiopianists, right? So Ethiopianism in the modern world. But I also make it clear that very few of these individuals probably have any kind of real connection to Ethiopia, right? But there's something about the imagination of that allows them to put themselves together to whatever is at their disposal, right? So it's almost using what's available, using what's before us to build a narrative of the self that permits us to lay claim to a history that is not told here, right? So I think it's building community, it's building historical imagination, but it's also, John, giving, I believe, these believers a sense of connection to something, right? When, and the present order, there was a deep disconnect from the world, right? Disconnect politically, disconnect economically, socially, disconnected educationally, right? But by turning to names, for instance, and using vocabulary like nation. And by the way, we see this in the Nation of Islam. We see it among Hebrew Israelites. We see it among Black Coptics. This language of nation becomes so important, not necessarily as not always, but certainly sometimes a critique on the present political order, but at its core, when people like the Nation of Islam and the Black Coptics and Hebrew Israelites are using words like nation, they're not thinking about nobody else. They are literally thinking about what we can build among ourselves, right? And so you find, for instance, in groups like the Nation of Islam, the building of farms, like in Muhammad farms, right? You find among the Hebrew Israelites the growing of crops, right? The growing of their own fruits and vegetables, etc. Raising flags, right? There's a flag in the Nation of Islam, right? There's a flag in the Black Coptic movement. There are flags in many of these traditions. Again, how do we build and imagine ourselves as having a nation, a land, and a home in a space that was not created for us? And so to go back to the old language of E. Franklin Frazier, it really is a nation within a nation, right? And for these people, we're not talking about just language just to be saying it. No, they are actually building what they believe to be an authentic nation, right?
Yeah.
For me, this is the performance of Black studies, right? Because my fear is that there are ways in which Black studies can become so theoretical and so theorized that we forget that Black folk actually exist, right? And what we see, I think, in these communities are the ways that academics are thinking about Black studies, thinking about Black life. For me, what I find among Black religions is the performance of what I think about. It is the performance of what I write about, which is why I make that ethnographic turn in my own research, which I hope we can get into.
Yeah, I mean, let me ask you about that. It's interesting that I know that you did your PhD in a department of theology, and you said divinity school degree, and you're in a Department of Religious Studies, but also African American Studies now. And then you talk about, ethnography being a part of your research methods. And so what's interesting to me is that there's this cluster of sort of non-disciplinary approaches, right? I think divinity schools are really a non-disciplinary, experience. I mean, it's about politics, literature,
that's right,
scripture, hermeneutics, history, and so forth. African American Studies, of course. I mean, Black Studies is anti-disciplinary in its very core. But theology and religious studies, they do have a disciplinary dimension to that. And so it's interesting to sort of see your journey, and then the ethnography thing is a really interesting piece to throw in there. But it's, you really move across disciplinary and non-disciplinary spaces. And I'm interested to hear how you think that movement in and out of discipline and non-discipline has shaped the way you conceive and execute a research project. But also, if you want, I'm always interested in how it shapes your construction and imagination and practice of a classroom.
Yeah. So theology is a highly disciplined subject. And when I thought about and think about, John, the kind of questions that I am raising, I quickly realized that theology was not providing me the space to think how I wanted to think about Black life. And so it was J. Cameron Carter who was very instrumental in helping me to sort of reframe.
On this podcast, by the way.
Oh, yes.
He was on the podcast early on.
Oh, is he really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who helped me to sort of, because he's also trained as a theologian, right? But I remember countless conversations with J. Cameron Carter, and Jay helping me to come to the realization that theology, the way I was studying it, just did not provide me with the language and the vocabulary to ask the questions and answer the questions that I was wrestling with. And so I quickly shifted. And I think, in my previous institution, I was at the Department of Theological Studies at St. Louis University. And it dawned on me, I think, pretty quickly that that just wasn't the space in which I wanted to think and write, right?
Uh-huh.
And so this move to Black studies at the U of I and religion was kind of a natural for me in terms of where my research was headed, especially with my ethnographic approaches. Now, theology, I think, is very discipline specific. I will say this. I think that there are ways that scholars of religion are really helping to bend this discipline and to, play with those boundaries, right, of religious studies in ways that I don't think theology can, because theology, in many ways is confessional, the very core of it, right? Religious studies for me, however, provides different talking partners, different colleagues to think about these questions. In religious studies, you find folks who are trained in English, who are trained in history, who are trained in theology, who are trained in various, sorts of disciplines, but asking the question about what people do with religion, how religion is used, right? So I do see religious studies as less disciplined as theology, but again, I agree. So moving here helped me to think about questions in very different ways. In the classroom, for me, this means more creativity in how I think about studying Black life with undergrads and graduate students. For instance, in the classroom, I make it clear to my students that I'm always interested in what people have to say. And I'm talking about research at this point, right? And so I introduce my students to what it means to be in the field, what it means to embed yourself with religious communities, but also what it means to get out the classroom, right? So I am known in my department for taking students into the field, right? For taking students on walks through cemeteries, or taking students to visit religious sites, to engage with religious communities as a way of seeing how the question of religion is dealt with outside traditional academic form. In other words, to see people as text. I'll say this really quickly. When I got into my current research on the Nation of Islam, I brought with me not just the vision of my childhood, because look, growing up in Chicago, John, it was not uncommon for me to, ride down what as the Dan Ryan, right? Or, walk inside, throughout Hyde Park or the far southeast side and see these handsomely dressed men wearing bow ties and selling bean pies and the final call. That was a part of my childhood. I saw it, right? I have people in my family who are in the nation, have been in the nation since I was a child, right? What I think moving into this ethnographic form permits me to do in the classroom is to discuss with students not just what formally trained academics have to say about the Nation of Islam or about the Black Coptic movement, but what believers themselves have to say about their experience within these traditions. And I have to say, there are narratives and my observations of being with religious communities that oftentimes turn upside down what I've read in academic text about these particular groups. And my own tentacles lead me to believe that the absence of engagement with these groups, of being embedded with them, oftentimes leads to conclusions that don't always align with what's happening inside these traditions. When I first met, for instance, with student minister Ishmael Muhammad, who is one of the sort of spokespersons, if you will, for the nation, we sat in his office at Mosque Mariam in Chicago, and he said to me when I was querying about whether or not they would agree to permit me to do this work, right? He said, well, you're the first person to ask, can you come and be with us and sit with us and dine with us?
Interesting.
And go to our janazas, the funerals, be with us in Juma prayer. He said, and I write about this in an article that I just published, that oftentimes we are written about, but not written with. And I explain to students, I try to get students to see the difference in different kinds of questions that can come from sitting with, being with, engaging with people in the practice of their tradition outside kind of the sort of literary texts or the textual, etc.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I think that, if you were to try to articulate, what some of the values and I would say principles of Black Studies classroom. I mean, I think you laid them out really well there in the context of your own research and teaching and interests, but that, it gives real content to what I think a lot of folks appeal to when they talk about Black Studies and use the word community, like what the community means. I don't think anybody ever means as like some sort of object of study, like we're looking through a microscope. Nobody means that, but you've really, I think, laid out not only a set of, sort of ethical guidelines, but also just concrete practices. And there's something beautiful and something terrifying about that comment. No one has ever asked to just come sit with us. That's something to say. Yeah. I imagine it was really something to hear.
It was something to hear. And it wasn't just that he said that. For me, John, and again, this is sort of where my current work is headed. The reception of this community to me as an outsider, as a scholar who is coming in to think with, to observe, to participate, has been nothing short of remarkable. And I must say, I'm really appreciative of the way that this community has embraced me and the kind of work that I'm doing.
That's great. So I have just a couple more questions. This next one, I think, in some ways you've already responded to this, but I'll ask it. And if you wanted to say what I said 20 minutes ago, that's also okay. But I'm interested in reflecting on the field of Black Studies. What you think that the field has done well, but also what you think it has not done particularly well.
Yeah, well, I think the field has not engaged religion enough. I think that is, again, just a glaring absence, in the field. I think what the field has gotten right is the way that we think with, study with, be with Black people in their journey in the diaspora, right? Of disentangling this notion of academic distance from our work, right? The Black Studies is invested work. It is work that comes from if I can use James Brown, it comes from the soul of people. And it is not merely a theoretical abstraction, but it deals with the concrete lived expressions and the cultural developments of Black folk throughout the diaspora. That Black studies engages the political, engages the social. It brings to forefront these issues precisely because Black life is at stake. And if we are not serious about engaging the political, the social, the economic, the policies of this world, then I don't think that we're doing Black studies. But I think Black studies has made this clarion call extremely clear and one of the core principles of what we do. Secondly, the Black studies is not divorced from this element of social activism, right? That and by the way, one does not need to be in the streets marching and protesting to be an activist, right? When I write about Black life in the context of a PWI, I am engaging in academic activism, right? When I engage in the work of thinking about Black religions that have been deemed cults, right, or that have been called anti-Semitic, I am engaging in religious activism, right? It's not discrediting or discounting some of those critiques, but it's also saying that these groups are in fact worth studying. And for me, that is when I study some of these groups, I am intentionally behaving as a fugitive in the academic world, right? I am fleeing the kind of orderly and the obedient ways of what academic discourse is supposed to look like, what we might call good religion or American religion, which is also problematic. But by bringing to the forefront the undercurrents of Black life, right? The undercurrents of Black worlds and those auspicious and inauspicious ways that Black life has been condemned, right? Be it through sex, be it through, ethics, be it through religion. When Black studies scholars raise and shine a light on, again, the underpinnings of our society and make those underpinnings the center of study, I think that is academic activism. And I think that is social activism, right? And so I think Black studies has done that very well. I think, again, just to kind of go to the beginning of this answer, bearing upon the question of religion, I think is where the field needs to be stronger. And I think we're getting there. The very presence of having a religious scholar on the podcast, J. Cameron Carter and others who may have been a part of this conversation, I think raises the stakes of religion and Black studies, which I think the two are indispensable as academic study and social activism.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so maybe that's also already part of an answer for my last question for you. I feel like sometimes the strengths and weaknesses of the field sort of lead directly to this, and this is definitely one of those cases, which is, in the Black studies context, what is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about, or the question you would want us to all be asking?
Yeah, I think I would go back to the way you phrased it earlier, and that is that Black studies do not think about research in Black people as objects in the scientific lab. But what might it mean to really raise the stakes on engaging Black people where they are, in their context, in their environment, by having more direct dialogue, more direct conversation with people on the ground, with the people we write about, right? And so for me, that is, I think, why I make the move toward ethnographic study, John, is because I am so curious about observing and being with and hearing the stories of people as they imagine Black life and Black culture, and helping to make sense of the way they're thinking and living and being, to help them articulate for a broader and wider audience, what Black life and Black culture is. And I think that for me is the real kind of benefit of the way in which I'm thinking about, Black studies. And so I would love to see more of that, right? More engagement with the everyday people. And by the way, my next book project is tentatively called Everyday Muslim, right? Because I am really concerned about the mundane, the quotidian, right? The way that Black religion shows up in the ordinary, the way people construct, live, determine their lives, the roads they take, the paths they build, right? So I think I would put a pin there, right, in terms of thinking about the field, where it's going, where I'm headed, and the real benefit of which I think comes from this kind of natural, direct engagement with people in their environment.
What a wonderful place to end. This is fantastic. And,
Thank you, John.
I was really excited about having you on the podcast for all the reasons I said at the outset. And this has just been so thoughtful and really provocative, and I find very edifying and ethically challenging in the best way, sort of make us ask our questions about our hard questions about our research and who we are in relation to our research. And I appreciate that so much. I think everyone who listens to this is going to walk away with so many thoughts and so many questions in the very, very best and most productive way. And that's because you really took the time to talk, but also to be, thoughtful and insightful. So thank you for that. I'm sure I say that on behalf of everyone who listens to this. This has been fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you, John. I've certainly enjoyed this dialogue, but also the space to think out loud.
Yeah.
With the Black Studies podcast. I've listened to several of these, by the way, I should say, and I've really enjoyed them, and glad that my voice and this conversation can be among what I think is a very rich program that you have here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I will pass that on to everybody who's working on the podcast. And also, I shouldn't let you get off this recording without just saying congratulations on your tenure and promotion.
Thank you so much.
Moment in time. That's a big deal. They can't take it away.
Thank you.
Well, they can't.
Thank you.
It's hard.
Thank you so much.
All right. So have a great rest of your day. Take care.
All right. You too, John.
All right, bye.